Thank you very much, Sir David, for coming to give evidence to our Select Committee this morning on net zero. We started this inquiry before the government amended the Climate Change Act to enshrine in legislation a commitment to net zero by 2050. And we started this inquiry because we believe in the imperative to take carbon out of our economy and out of our atmosphere. You, Sir David, have devoted much of your life to showing us the beauty of our planet, but also the changes that are being done to it. And we want to explore some of that this morning, as well as public attitude towards global warming, climate change, and the actions that not just government, but all of us need to take to live our lives in a different way to help us conserve the planet and all those things that are dear to us. So if I could start, Sir David, by asking, in your experience, working around the world over a number of decades, what for you is the most striking impact of climate change that you have experienced firsthand?
I think the most vivid probably was a few years ago, sadly, now, was on the Barrier Reef. I first went to the Barrier Reef in the 1950s, and I was a young underwater swimmer, diver, and I remember it's the most vivid memory of mine, almost of my natural history life, the extraordinary experience of diving on a reef and suddenly seeing this multitude of fantastically beautiful forms of animals that you'd never seen before, fishes of all kinds, organisms of all kinds that you didn't really know what they were, even you were supposed to be a zoologist. There are more individuals and more variety of life there than on a coral reef than anywhere else in the world, even more than the tropical rainforest. And I'm not a very good underwater swimmer, but I've been there a number of times. And I will never forget diving on a reef, which was about 10 years ago now, and suddenly seeing that instead of this multitude of wonderful forms of life, that it was stark white. It had bleached white because of the rising temperatures and the increasing acidity of the sea. And you may say, well, it was beauty and all that complexity and interests you as a naturalist. That's true. But in fact, it's crucial to the world because coral reefs, about 30 to 40% of all oceanic fish throughout the seas depend upon the coral reefs at some time of their lives. And if you lose, because they either spawn there or they're fish there that grow up, it's a nursery of the reef. And if you wipe that out, you wipe out whole areas of the ocean. And the notion that somehow we had stopped this, the oceans on which we depend for our food, and so many nations around the world do, is appalling. And that was the first time that I really thought, because the notion, a particular rhinoceros may disappear. It's sad to people who care about natural history and rhinoceroses, but it didn't strike that the whole population of the world is going to be affected, as it now is. The other time I have seen evidence was in South Georgia, in the Antarctic, just outside the Antarctic Circle, which is the richest form of Antarctic life, of hundreds of thousands of penguins and seals and so on. And I stood, first time I went there was about 30 years ago, and I had stood at the bottom of a glacier. And 10 years ago I went back and stood in the same place, and the glacier wasn't even visible. It had just retracted. Now, skeptics will say, I can take you to another place where the glaciers grew or something, and I can take you to a place where the coral reefs are flourishing. So it's very difficult to pick one point, which is one site at which you can actually say that's a proof. It isn't. It's just an example. The proof is in the graphs. The proof is in the scientific records. The proof is in when you analyse bubbles from the sea ice and glacier ice to show you what has happened to the climate over the years. That's what the proof is. But the illustrations are those two. Sorry for such a long answer.
And do you think, Sir David, that the trend is worsening? Is it speeding up?
Yes. Yes, because the whole process is speeding up. I mean, after all, 50 years ago, it hadn't even really started. I mean, of course, the climate, the atmosphere was there and it had its various constituents. But 50 years ago, yes, 60 years ago even, when I was making natural history programs, nobody thought that the climate was changing. If there was any concern about the welfare of the natural world, it was that individual species were disappearing. But nobody thought that human beings could change the climate. And we now know we are. And what is worse, of course, is that we are changing the climate in a way that is irreversible. Certainly within our, not our lifetime, but in our grandchildren's lifetime, it's irreversible, if we go on the way we are.
Thank you. Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for coming before the committee this morning. I was given a copy of Life on Earth on my 9th birthday by my parents. And back then you opened the world to kids like me into the natural world. You described the world and you showed the world and you explained things that were happening that were inconceivable to a kid back then. You didn't talk about the impact and its relationship with humans very much, with the exception of your visit to the gorilla community. But now you're playing a very assertive role in the relationship between man and the natural world. Do you think, looking back on your career, you wish you'd done that earlier?
We didn't know. We really didn't know. 50 years ago, it seemed inconceivable. I mean, it wasn't inconceivable that we could exterminate a species. I knew that gorillas could have been exterminated had we not taken action, and that's so. But I didn't believe that we could change the climate by human beings. Or worse, that the changes that we were going to impose on the climate will be irreversible, which is what they will be if we go on the way we are.
But your role has turned into more of a campaigning role, hasn't it? Because you've been more, you've used a position that you have to try and change behaviour, whereas you didn't do that back in the 70s.
No, because I'm not by nature a propagandist, and I'm not even, I mean, I started making natural history programs because I thought there was nothing I preferred to see more on television than the beauties of the natural world. And I would love to just be going on doing that. I mean, that's what I enjoy. I enjoy looking at birds of paradise in display. I enjoy coral reefs. I enjoy these things. And I enjoy bringing them to people who don't have the good luck that I've had. So that's fun. But if you become aware of what is happening in the natural world, you don't have any alternative. Now, 50 years ago, we weren't doing all that. And 50 years ago, there were quite a lot of people who would say, no, it's rubbish. Of course we aren't affecting anyone else. There were a lot of people saying that. And if you want to work for the BBC, which is what I did and have done for all my life, 50 years ago, there was a duopoly. There was BBC and there was commercial television. And the BBC was a public service. And if you're a public service, you have to represent a public point of view. And you can't use it for propaganda.
But so therefore, did you waited for the public mood to change before you started becoming quite assertive with the impact that humans were having on the natural world?
Not quite as easy as that. I didn't wait for public opinion to change. I waited until the facts seemed incontrovertible. 50 years ago, the people who were saying protect the natural world, we weren't talking about changing the climate because that was not a possibility. It hadn't occurred to us. We were talking about saving gorillas. We were talking about saving giraffes and rhinoceroses and elephants and so on. That was perfectly a valid attitude to take. But you shouldn't be campaigning. The BBC is not a campaigning organisation. The BBC has a responsibility to present problems to the public in a way which is the public cannot avoid.
Are there issues that, I mean, your series are between 8 and 13 episodes, typically if you look back at your career. Are there issues out there that you've come across that unfortunately you just couldn't give a full episode to, but you therefore haven't covered with regards to the impact that humankind is having on the natural world?
Yes, the style of television has changed. That's for the BBC to decide that, and the BBC has to react to changes in styles and so on. And the 13-part series, which Life on Earth, which you kindly mentioned, was one of the first, which took a serious subject and looked at it over 13 1-hours. There are very few programmes like that. The BBC doesn't do that anymore, but it does individual programmes. And I do for example, at the beginning of the millennium, I did a programme on population that was quite straightforwardly taking a problem which was not high on the public list and informing about it. How many people can the world can live on planet Earth, it was called.
Are there other issues like you cover plastics, are there other issues like plastics which you don't think have gone mainstream in the UK that you're chomping at the bit to get out there?
Yeah, well, the plastic issue is a very interesting one. In that I've been going on about plastics for 20 years because it is anybody who swims knows that, and anybody who travels actually to the Paris can see the horrors of what plastic pollution can do. And I've been putting it in programmes for years, and nobody took much notice of it. And Blue Planet 2, it was a sequence that lasted about 2 minutes maximum, I should say. And yet suddenly, for some reason, which if I knew what the reason was, I'd be a richer man, I dare say. But for some reason, it rang a bell in the public consciousness. I've never known anything like it. For 90 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever it was, to have the effect that it had was absolutely extraordinary.
I suppose every human being has a relationship with plastic, so it's relatable. But finally, for me, you've previously said that you don't want to be alarmist and that sometimes talking about extinction is a turn-off for viewers. How do you editorially get right the balance between education and entertainment?
Well, I in a serious way, I don't see any difference between education and entertainment. If you're educational and boring, then you're wasting your time anyway. And if you're entertaining, but about trivial things, then you're missing a great opportunity. So the best programmes in my book are those that do both those things simultaneously. I started, Life on Earth was there in order to that people should understand and delight in the fantastic story of how life developed on this planet in 13 hours. And they did enjoy it. That was what it was about. I wasn't electioneering, but at the end I had to say something about the future. And I said what I said. But by and large, I only wish I didn't have to make programs that were propagandizing or arguing or polemical. I just wish people could look at the programme for the natural world for what it is. And the amazing thing is, of course, that we now know that that's not, as you to use your word, just entertainment. We actually know that people depend upon the natural world for their very sanity. And that in moments of crisis in their lives, the natural world is the one place and the one climate in which they can get solace. The natural world is profoundly important to us all. And it isn't just because you're interested in counting birds or something, or indeed counting wildflowers. It is much more profound on that. From a practical point of view, we are dependent upon the natural world for every breath of air we take and every mouthful of food that we eat. But it's even more than that. We also depend on it for our sanity and our sense of proportion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just bring in Albert Owen.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, Sir David, that in the 50s nobody really knew about it or talked about the link between human and climate change. But I think an epoch moment for me was in the 1980s with CFCs and the link between the ozone layer depleting. The BBC then almost had unanimity with scientists coming on saying this was a problem and it could be repaired if we disposed of those gases in a different way. And James Lovelock has led on this, as you know. Do you think the BBC should have gone further? And that was the moment when that link was established and maybe done more?
I didn't think there was any need for it to go further, in point of fact, because those that understand and those with their hands on power were convinced simply on the scientific evidence. It wasn't put to the vote. in the way that other issues might be. It was scientists, informed people, informed politicians could see that it had to be done. Not only that, but they also saw the solution, which was to deal with CFCs. And so it was never put to the electorate, would you like us to eliminate CFCs or not? Because nobody ever heard of
the politicians
CFCs.
did act.
But politicians did it, and the civil service, the government did it, because they could see it was correct and had to be done. And that was one of the great examples of the nations of the world collaborating. In a democratic sense, that's an overstatement slightly, but in an informed power sense, it's not an overstatement. People who, scientists and responsible governments around the world, saw what the problem was, saw that it was incontrovertible, and decided to do it. It wasn't put to a vote. It wasn't an electioneering proposition, in the way that the problems we are now facing has to be in a democratic society.
Okay. Thank you. Sir Patrick.
Thank you. Sir David, thank you for coming along this morning. I add my thanks to everybody else. As a presenter, what do you think the challenge is for anybody working on communicating climate change to the public and politicians are? Is there a sort of a problem of sort of almost expecting the United Kingdom to be able to sort this problem when actually it's a much bigger problem?
I don't think that anybody supposes that the problem is just UK. I think that the scientists, the British scientists, have been absolutely foremost in the research and in making clear that research. This country and America in particular have been very, very active in studies of the upper atmosphere. And it's there that the evidence lay. And so, yes, British scientists have been foremost. And that's a matter of pride, I suppose. Certainly the CFC thing was a discovery of British scientists working for the British Antarctic Survey, an organisation of which this country should be very proud. I mean, we have a history of Antarctic polar exploration, second to none. And that was a direct result of scientific research down in the South Pole.
If one considers what progress has been made in this country as far as recognising the problem and I think the general acceptance now across the political sphere that we've got problems that we've got to deal with and we've got to deal with as quickly as possible, the government have accepted the 2050 target. There are other organisations which are urging us to go a lot faster to 2025. Do you think that that 2025 target would be realistic, or do you think the 2050 figure is much more realistic?
I don't know. In a way, I would think that is not the way of focusing the problem. We cannot be radical enough in dealing with the issues that face us at the moment. The question is what is practically possible. How can we take the electorate with us in dealing with these things? Because it costs money in realistic terms. I mean, dealing with these problems means we've got to change our lifestyle. Dealing with the problem is going to cost internationally, it's going to cost money. And so the question is how fast can we go, is how fast can we carry the electorate with us? The most encouraging thing that I see, of course, is that the electors of tomorrow are already making that to themselves, their voices very, very clear. And that is a source of great comfort in a way, but also of justification and reality that these people, young people now, are recognising that their world is what is the future. I'm okay, for the next decade. I'm okay, and all of us here are okay, because we won't face the problems that are coming. But in the problems in another 20, 30 years are really major problems that are going to cause great social unrest and great changes in the way that we live, in what we eat and how we live and so on. That's going to happen.
I think it is fair to say that 15 years ago there were probably a lot of people that were described as climate change deniers. I think that number has significantly reduced over the past 15 years, but there are still some people that would deny climate change and say this is natural order, the world has always changed, the environment's always changed, and we're sort of over panicking. What would your response be to that?
I think that the voice of criticism and the voice of disbelief should not be stamped on in that sort of way. It is very, very important that the voices of dissent should have a place where they're heard, and a place where the arguments between the two sides can be worked out in public and declared and analysed in public. That's very important. And I am sorry that there are people who are in power internationally, notably, of course, the United States, but also in Australia, which is extraordinary, actually, because Australia is already facing having to deal with some of the most extreme manifestations of climate change. Both Australia and America, those voices are clearly heard, and one hopes that the electorate will actually respond to those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting what you said, Sir David, about we can't go fast enough on this. The only issue is what speed will the public accept given the costs and the changes to people's lifestyles. One of the things that we're looking to do as a select committee, working with other select committees in Parliament, is to set up a series of citizens' assemblies to present some of the facts to people, but also get them through a process of deliberation to focus on what needs to be done, both at a national level, but also in the way we live our lives. Have you had any experience of that sort of thing? And do you think it could be a way of making that change at an individual level that is needed?
No, I don't know how you do it, except that you do it. That if you only did it from in one area, it would be very suspect. You would think, who was it who's trying to deal with that? I mean, looking at past issues like tobacco, for example. I mean, if the only people who are saying that tobacco was not evil, if they were suppressed, and that would be catastrophic.
So it needs to make sure that it has a cross-section of people
Yes.
in it, and from people from all around the country to
Yes,
have a
but
proper
I think
conversation.
that the message is from all ages and from all points of view. Everybody has to be convinced about this. There will always be a minority, I hope a tiny minority, that says well, we don't believe it, and keeping us focused on being clear ourselves as to what the problem is.
Thank you. Vernon Coker.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Sir David. This whole issue that you've been addressing, as well as other things about public involvement and perception, and you made a very interesting comment, I thought, about how we have to take the electorate with us, or how do we take the electorate with us. In the public engagement with yourself over the last few years in particular, has that public engagement with you changed in terms of what they contact you about? Or has it stayed the same?
It has been transformed, and I don't quite know why it is. I suppose, reflecting on it, that there was a time in the 19th century when it was perfectly acceptable for civilized human beings to think that it was morally acceptable to actually own another human being as a slave. And somehow or other, in the space of, I suppose, about 20 or 30 years, the public perception of that totally transformed. By the middle of the 19th century, it was becoming intolerable to suppose that anybody could suppose that. Now, there's a huge change in the public perception, and if you like, in public perception of moralities. And I suspect that we are right now in the beginning of a big change. Young people, particularly, are the stimulus that's bringing that about, in which people are slowly beginning to, members of the public are understanding that to chuck plastic into the ocean is an insult. To have the nerve to say this is our rubbish and then we'll give you money and if you could spread it on your land instead of ours in the Far East is intolerable. And for some reason or other, young people see that very clearly now. And that's a source of great hope to me.
And given that, do you think those young people, say in particular, do you think they have enough opportunity to influence the decision makers and be involved with the decisions that are taken? I mean, you spoke very movingly, didn't you, at the COP24 recently about decision makers waking up, in a sense, to this. Do you see enough opportunity for people to be involved?
Well, I certainly do. I mean, the mere fact that you've invited me here, it means that you are well aware of what the circumstances are and how important it is that you who make our laws should be aware of these things, and that the electorate who vote for you should also be aware and require you to take advantage of these sort of things. Absolutely so.
And do you think, Sir David, that we're slow in reacting to that public perception, that public change, or, to be polite, is quickening up or speeding up, or that politicians need to get a move on?
Well, yes, of course it's slow in an ideal sense, in that one ideally would like, those of us who are convinced about it, would like to say, tomorrow we'll do something really extreme.
Yeah.
But that's not the way the world works, and we have to. In practical terms, the practical effect that this country has, practical as against theoretical or intellectual, the practical is small. The whole of the world has got to deal with this if we're going to deal with it at all. We are in a position where we are, it's a proud position to hold, in that we have been amongst the forerunners who have been drawing attention to this worldwide, and we are taking the rest of the world, have many other parts of the world are following, and some of them still haven't followed, as we know. But by and large, the movement is growing and accelerating, as far as I can see.
And the protest movements have contributed to that change in the public perception and the pressure, in a good way, on politicians in a democratic society. Do you see, trying to think of the way of putting this, do you see this change in mood across the whole of the population, across the whole of the income groups, across the whole of that? You know, the argument that used to, we can't do this because, which is the point I thought you made about taking the electorate with us. If it's a choice between climate and jobs and climate and prosperity, but young people seem to be pushing the idea that maybe we are going to have to put a pause on always expecting an increase in our standard of living and always expecting that. Do you get any sense of that difference or between income groups, if you like, for want of a better way of putting it?
I think young people have an easier way of visualising idealistic views, and of not being fully aware of some of the more practical consequences that those of us who live rather longer know that it's quite easy to formulate, to state idealism, but it does come at a cost. But I think young people are sufficiently convinced of it to hold to their beliefs, and will hold us to account.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Sir David. The UN State of Nature report, the UN Nature report, indicated that 1 million species are in effect under threat from human activity. Do you think that's linked to climate change, or is it also linked to other factors like population growth?
Yes, both those things are having a great effect on the natural world. Certainly population growth is. And the reasons that there are problems in Africa are that the population growth is particularly high in Africa. And if you travel over the Great Plains where all these wonderful creatures live, you realise that when you're getting there, that you're driving through a lot of human habitation. There are a lot of people, and around the margins of the great national parks, there are people who want land. And as there are, many of the people live on directly and from the land, that is their salvation. They see, why should those animals eat when we are starving? So yes, there's a huge problem between that, between population growth and conservation.
So you'd agree with the scenario that there is an ecological emergency, but you also spoke about how our connection with nature has a profound impact on man, as it were. So what do you think the most significant way is that the changes in the natural world are now affecting the human world, as it were?
Well, they're affecting us from every point of view. They're affecting us and increasingly so in where are we getting our food from. We depend upon the natural world for food, and we've even thought that until recently that the oceans there were infinitely large, and we could actually always get enough food to feed us, at least from the sea. That's not so. If you look back at the history, I mean, there was once the cod, the herring in the 18th, 19th century, which existed in the North Sea in immense quantities, and you couldn't believe that human beings would have any effect on. We effectively exterminated the cod that was also up in the North Sea. That's gone, and so we started fishing in Newfoundland, where were the great fishing grounds of the North American waters. They are now gone, and so simply we are now catching fish in order to grind it up in order to feed it to farm fish, and it can't go on, and we are going to have to look for new sources of food. We really are, unless we do something about population. Someone said, I mean, it's an old joke, someone said, if you believe that you can have infinite growth in a finite situation, you are either an economist or a madman.
Given that the government has now introduced the net zero target, or legislated for it in the UK, how do you think that net zero target could benefit habitats that you've visited and the species that live in them?
Which target is that?
The net zero, the carbon
the net zero.
Yeah.
Well, it gives a measurement, a calibration, a target to see where we're going and what we're aiming at, which is measurable. And that's the advantage of it, because the problem we're dealing with is so pervasive that you can't just say we're winning here or we're losing there. You have to make a summation of it in some way, and the zero growth in world temperatures provides us with that measurement. In a way, it is not as dramatic a one as one might wish, because non-scientific people might say 1.5 degrees. Come on, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, ridiculous, and we can do it. We can't, because of course that is an average, and it doesn't deal with the highs and the lows.
And you spoke about the soil depletion and I think threat to insect life that will affect our food production. But in terms of preserving the habitats that you've seen and some of the environments that are perhaps not in the UK, would you say to constituents about how they would benefit economically and socially from preservation of habitats that may be a long way outside their local park or their nearby forestry commission site? Or
well, of course, if they are a long way, they are beyond our jurisdiction anyway. And you may say, well, we can help through subsidies, we can help encourage things internationally, and I think we should. And I wouldn't be surprised if people were quite as critical as you suggest they might be. And in a way, it's rather strange that people should care about gorillas, but they do. Mm. In that series which you mentioned, when I showed gorillas, and was then subsequently able, mountain gorillas that is, and was then subsequently say that they've been reduced in numbers. The public really responded. I mean, responded with big money, and it's one of the encouraging things to say in a rather discouraging world. That in fact there are now twice as many mountain gorillas in that area than there were when I first made that film. And when you say that, people's eyes light up. I mean, they are pleased. Yeah. And they aren't so parochial as to say, I don't give a damn about elephants. They clearly do. And thank goodness they do. And that's at least something you can put to the credit of the human race.
Thank you.
Thank you. Drew Hendry.
Hello, Sir David. Do you think the UK is still showing world leadership when it comes to tackling climate change?
Do I think
the UK is still showing world leadership when it comes to tackling climate change?
I think our record has been pretty good. And actually, it has historical roots. And so it should have, because in fact, who started the problem? This country. It was the Industrial Revolution that started here. And what was the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution was based on burning coal in the late 18th, early 19th century. And we, as it were, started the problems. And if we are now taking a lead in solving the problems, then that's only as right and responsible of us so to do.
In Scotland, the Scottish Government have set a world-leading target of 2045 to be carbon neutral. Do you think that's important? And how does UK action and ambition affect target and policy settings in other countries?
Could it?
How does it affect policy and target settings in other countries?
Well, in theory it is. In theory, the countries of the world in COP21 in Paris made that agreement that they would. There is somebody who's withdrawn, of course, as we know, or threatened to withdraw, because the United States, as I understand it, the United States actually is still bound by the agreement that it made there, and hasn't yet been able to do the legal processes to contradict them, to release them from those obligations. Of course, the President wants to do so and has said that he's going to do so, and it'll be a very, very sad day away from when he succeeds. But nations have there has become an international recognition of the unity of the globe that didn't exist, until relatively recently in our history. In our history is by and large a history about fighting with other nations. I mean, it is not about agreements. But the United Nations, and before then the League of Nations, have been attempts to bring it around to solve things by other ways except by fighting. And now the United Nations is one of the foremost places where, in fact, all these things are being debated, particularly with the COP process. And I remember walking out with the then chief scientist, Sir David of this country, of walking out and him saying, we've done it. And this country and the people, scientists of this country, have been absolutely foremost in bringing that to international attention.
So do you think the UK government's 2050 net zero target represents the UK doing its fair share of limiting global warming to 1.5? Do you think the government's net zero target of 2050 represents the UK doing its fair share of limiting global warming to 1.5%?
Yes, I do. My only hope is that we don't backslide. And the hope that no other country backslides either. But it's a tough target. I mean, it's not an easy statement to have made, and it's going to cost money. I mean, that's the nub of it. I mean, it's not just piety, which anybody can express pious views. It's actually a practical commitment, and I hope to goodness that we can achieve it and stick by it.
So, from what you're saying, you would say that the UK setting a target for 2050 for net zero is a good thing to do, and that Scotland setting a target for 2045 is also a good thing to do. What do you say to those who argue that the UK can't fix climate change on its own because of bigger emitters like China? So why try? Why should we do these things?
Well, that is a very dismal and pessimistic view of life. To go through and say, oh, well, we're not going to bother, when you can actually, when you've done the arguments, you've explained the argument that it is absolutely essential that it should be done. Essential, if we are going to avoid massive social unrest, apart from anything else, massive destructions of all sorts of systems. And we say, oh, well, yes, it's going to happen, so we'll wash our hands of it. We have the nations of the world in COP21 have mapped out in detail a practical way of dealing with this, and thank goodness have carried the rest of the nations, all the contributors agreed to do it. It's going to be difficult, but to say it's difficult, therefore we won't try, is simply not acceptable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark Horsey.
Sir David, I want to follow on the points that Vernon Coker made, really, which is the impact on our prosperity of the changes that you're arguing we should make. We're the Business Committee as well as being the Energy Committee, and so we're very interested in the competitiveness and the ability of British industry and British manufacturers to create the jobs and the prosperity that this country needs. Do you think that we've got contradictory objectives here if we want to increase prosperity at the same time as deal with the issue affecting our climate?
There are also huge opportunities of development, huge opportunities of getting things right and benefiting as a consequence. And I have been speaking recently with various in Gestalt, for example, and with the international financial bodies. And it's clear to them that actually this is an opportunity to get things right. This is an opportunity to make big profits. This is an opportunity in which to innovate new systems. And if we're ahead of the game, we will benefit as a consequence.
And do people understand the lifestyle changes that they need to make? Let's take air travel, for example. I mean, aerospace is a big and important industry in the UK. We're expanding our airports. Do you think people are willing and ready to reduce the number of flights they make, for example, in order to achieve the changes that we're arguing for?
Well, they won't. Can't believe they will just be happily say, "Oh, yes, I don't care. I'm just going ahead." And there's a way, of course, in which those in power, as it is, influence how many people take it, and that's economically. I mean, you adjust the price to the various restrictions that you have.
So you would argue that air travel should become more expensive, Sir David?
I think that. One way of reducing these things is to count the cost of what it is that the air travel costs in real terms, in terms of the environment. And if you cost that, you would see that the tickets are extraordinarily cheap.
And should we reduce people's expectation of being able to make a couple of flights every year to Spain or France or on holiday? Do you think we should restrict that in some way?
I don't know how you would restrict it other than economically.
And is that not going to affect those who are less able to pay? Is there an equality issue here? Are you happy with that?
I'm afraid that is the case.
And are people guilty of tokenism? I mean, we're talking, for example, people will make an effort to use less plastic, but is that really going to have a significant impact on changing our climate? Are people just going to, or maybe say, well, I'll take one less overseas holiday than I might have? Do people really understand the changes that they will have to make in their lifestyle?
I don't know the answer to that, but I don't know how else you would actually transfer it into practical business, into practical life, except by putting that. I mean, you put the economic factor into it. Of course, it would be nice to think that we were also putting the theoretical argument which you've outlined, which is that we shouldn't be all travelling. I mean, I certainly worry that the job I do involves me travelling. I have travelled by air only too frequently in the last 6 months alone in order to make programmes. Some of them programmes about the very subject that we're talking about, which is, I dare say, a paradox. But certainly we're going to have to. Of course, the long-term solution is that you work out a way of powering aeroplanes electrically, and that's already practical. And if you can actually translate that so that air transport becomes non-polluting, then that's the way out, and we're back in a tolerable circumstance.
Okay, and if people do have to change their lifestyles, and it involves them being perhaps slightly less well off, perhaps enjoying their life slightly less because they're not able to travel as much, do you think there's a backlash? I mean, you spoke very convincingly about the change in attitude of young people. Do you think that, I mean, as politicians, we are rewarded for economic growth, for helping people be better off, and you're arguing that we should be looking to restrict that in some way. Is there a danger of it?
I'm arguing that unless we do restrict it to some degree, they're going to have a much bigger and more serious collapse.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Albert Owen.
Not quite.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Stephen Kerr, do you want to come in?
I want to follow up, Sir David, on what Mark Posey said, because one of the concerns I've got is that there's such a low level of engagement at a practical level in terms of what lifestyle changes will be asked of people, that when there is a dawning realisation of what these changes might mean in terms of lifestyle, that there will be a negative reaction. Does that concern you? And what message would you give to government in terms of engaging with people at the practical level of what lifestyle changes are necessary?
Well, certainly. And so what you're really the problem you're opening now is a very serious one. We are. If the world climate change goes on as it is, we are going to be facing huge problems with immigration. Large parts of Africa will become even less inhabitable than they are now, and there's going to be major upsets in the balance between our national boundaries. And what President Trump is doing about Mexico, and indeed what the rest of Europe is doing about people coming from Africa now, those kind of problems are going to grow inexorably, and we're going to have to decide what we're going to do about it. And I don't pretend I know the answer to that, but I don't. That's for the future, but that's going to happen.
But you think that government should engage with people more widely to illustrate what these lifestyle changes that will be necessary on our part in relation to these changes?
I think that an awareness of what the problems are inevitably a part of the arguments that are about restricting temperature rise.
Yeah. And I think the more micro level these lifestyle changes are as things stand, the more the public will embrace them.
Let us hope. I mean, one can only hope that the answer to problems is understanding and not ignorance.
Thank you. Sir David, you said recently at Davos, and I quote selectively here, "We can create a world of clean air and water, unlimited energy and fish stocks that we can sustain us well into the future, but we need a plan." What is that plan? What would you like to see governments collectively across the globe do immediately to address the problem?
I don't suppose I could possibly outline a plan in that sort of way. What I suppose I was thinking about, talking about that, is that we should expose what these problems are. We could expose what we think solutions of them are, and think about the consequences. I don't see we can do better than that.
Okay, so what kind of life do you think our grandchildren are going to lead? You mentioned earlier this is not a problem for us that are in this room, but for future generations. I mean, and can humanity address the impact of climate change in time so they have a decent life?
I suppose you have to define what you think about a decent life, and
Sure.
that must be bound up with, in fact, what your ambitions are as a human being. And that's a question of individual moralities as to how you accept inequalities between human beings.
But you also mentioned that some of the larger countries in the world are not sort of pulling their weight at this moment in time. I mean, you refer to the United States, that its legal obligations of COP agreements, etc. China is quite optimistic about the future. A couple of years ago, the Institute said there was no way we could reduce, the temperatures wouldn't be reduced by 1.5. It's now saying it can be done. So what do countries of the world need to be doing now so that future generations can look to us and say they're making a good job of it, so that for our future?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, the question is, you said that there should be a plan, right? You're not sure what the plan should be. So let me ask you, the first question to you was, what had you seen in your long life of reporting that was stark, that you saw there was climate change? What do you think we should do now that could reverse that? What should be done? I think it is fair to ask you a question so that you can help us in our deliberations as we move forward.
I think we should be doing, we should be investing, encouraging industry to invest in new techniques to deal with the generation of power. One of the paradoxes is that the power is streaming down on the earth from the sun with no restriction on it at all. And we can draw it directly with no problems, except to properly take advantage of that, we have to make sure that we have got ways in which we can store power, batteries which we can store power on a major scale, and ways in which we can transport power without a major loss of the product, as it were. So it would be possible, if we can solve those problems, we can change the polluting problems of both airlines and motor cars. Now we're on the way to that. The scientific knowledge known already there as to how to deal with the batteries and so on is also there. And if we can only coordinate the methods in which, the practical methods in which we can bring about storage and transport of energy, we have got a huge solution to a majority, or to a great number of our problems.
Do you think we're making progress? Do you think we're making good progress?
Well, I think we probably are. And I don't know, there are all sorts of suggestions that come through my post, and maybe yours too, of people who think that they know a solution in which way they could do each one of those problems. I've met quite a lot of people who are absolutely certain that they know how they could actually store energy, for example. Now, I'm not a physicist, I'm not an industrialist, I'm not an economist, so I don't know what stands in their way. I don't know where the hitches are. But there are people who understand that, and I just hope they're getting on with it.
Finally, we, in an earlier exchange, talked about CFCs in the 1980s, and there was a solution to that. Do you think the world now understands climate change and we can find a solution? I want to finish my question on a line of optimism.
I don't know about the world. Generalisations of that scale is beyond me, I'm afraid. Even I don't really understand our society. How do I know what people in the height and all corners of this British society are thinking? I don't know. And I suspect none of us do. But all we can go on is talking about what we think are the sensible solutions to the problems that we also ought to recognise.
Young people, and there's many sitting behind you here, have given us hope as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, some of these protests, the school strikes, etc., has given us hope.
The idealism of youth is something that should be treasured and respected. And let us hope they maintain it into their adult life.
Thank you.
Stephen Kerr and then Vernon Coker.
Just building on what Albert was saying, I think what we're really trying to ascertain from you is, are you optimistic that we're going to be able to crack this problem of climate change?
Do you know, I have no idea what the future holds. Okay. I see no future in being pessimistic, because that leads you to say, then to hell with it. Why should I care? And I believe that way disaster lies. So I feel an obligation. It's the only way you can get up in the morning is to believe that actually we can do something about it. And I suppose I think we can. Whether that is optimistic or not, I don't know. And whether in fact it's going to produce a result or not, whether I don't know. But that's the only way I can operate. That I have to get up in the morning and say, something has got to be done, and I will do my best to bring that about.
Thank you. Vernon Coker?
Thank you, Chair. Just to finish on this this optimism, Melissa, one or two other questions, I'm not sure, but Peter Kyle and I were just talking about the fact, Sir David, that to our committee, you've drawn the youngest audience that we've ever had, and the serious point to it is the fact that you, as somebody who's worked for decades in this area, the optimism must be that you've inspired a young generation. I mean, they're impacting behind you, and that was the point of the questions that I've asked and others have asked about. We have to be optimistic but challenge ourselves, it seems, to do better. But you look at all these young people here demanding that. I'm sure they've come for us as well, but no.
It is their world that we are playing. It is their futures that are in our hands. And if these places around here, there, don't inspire you to do that, I don't know what will.
Here.
I think just building on that, and I think that's an important point that both Albert and Vernon make about the audience today, and it's wonderful to see so many young people coming in because they care so passionately about this. And certainly I was saying to you, Sir David, before this session started, when I go into schools in my constituency and I ask them if they could be Prime Minister for the day, what one thing would they want to do? And the answer comes back time and time again on issues around environment and climate change, whether it is stop polluting the oceans with plastic or reducing the number of cars in the local area because of the terrible effects of air pollution. And I just wonder whether I could just use the audience for a moment and just ask, who here thinks that climate change is enough of a priority, and who thinks that government should go further? Who thinks it's enough of a priority today? Who thinks government should go further and push further and faster on this? I think that the vast majority say that should go further, and I think that's a lesson for all the politicians around this table, and I hope that we will reflect that in the report that we'll be producing, and that government will listen as well. And I would just say to everybody watching today, keep the pressure up on us, because as politicians we respond to the public. That's our job. And if you tell us loudly and over again that this is your priority, it will be for more politicians a priority. And David, thank you for everything that you've done to inspire the young people and all of us as well today, because this for us I think has probably been the most inspiring session, certainly since I've become chair of the Select Committee, to have had the privilege to chair. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you everybody for coming to observe today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that's never happened either. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.